to fund K-State Vet Med at $7.5 million and to zero out funding for K-State 105. And so Chairman Waymaster and Appropriations had directed me to get some more information from the university about K-State 105 and Vet Med to see if it is possible to do both this budget cycle. Then we'll have a presentation by the Kansas Board of Regents talking about the budget process that they go through and for us to learn more about how they arrive at base funding for institutional, each of their institutions. That discussion, we had a discussion as a committee, learning about some possible either perceived or real discrepancies or disparities between the regional universities and the three big research universities. So we'll learn more about their budget process, how they arrive at some of the base funding and the historical allotment. So without further ado, we will start a presentation. I'd like to welcome to the podium President of Kansas State University, Dr. Richard Linton. President Linton, thank you for being here and welcome back to the committee.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Howe and the rest of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to come back and revisit. And it looks like you're looking for a solution about how to support things that are most important to Kansas State University. If we recall in the conversation we had a few weeks ago, we talked about two main priorities. K-State 105 was really our top external priority from an economic growth and economic creation and job creation perspective that supports the entire state. When we talk about the most important internal priority for Kansas State University, this is support for the College of Veterinary Medicine. And if we recall, we showed a slide relative to the overall support of our College of Veterinary Medicine compared to other colleges around the country. We fall about $12 million plus under the average of support. And we need to be a top 3 to top 5 vet school, I believe, at Kansas State University to be able to partner with our BRI facility and the new NBAF facility that was just put in place last year. So I'm prepared to talk about your proposal of shifting from what the original recommendation was from this committee to a split support of both K-State 105 and the College of Veterinary Medicine. I can just very simply say if we were to go in that direction strategically for K-State 105, it simply means a smaller footprint. We'd be thinking about 80% or so of the productivity that we would be able to have with a $5 million level of support. But I think it would also allow us to be a little bit more creative relative to our partnerships. As you remember, all programs in K-State 105 are to be sustainable, and we look for a one-to-one match holistically. I think we could look harder to be able to try to get those matches as we move forward. I think for the College of Veterinary Medicine, we talked about a couple of different components. We talked about the need for additional faculty support. We're right on the fringe of potentially losing accreditation, and we're really concerned about that. There's operational support that's also important and well needed. And the other piece, which I think is very important to Kansans, is right now we have a 60-40 out-of-state, in-state acceptance. With the $3.5 million, we would put most of our efforts towards the essential operational support, the essential faculty that would be needed, but to make that full shift from 60-40 to 40-60, that would be our area of emphasis that we think is most important. So with that, I'm here for questions and conversation.
Okay, thank you, President Linton. And so what happened in the House Appropriations Committee meeting when we're doing the report outs, there was an amendment to split out the $7.5 million. $4 million would go to K-State 105 and $3.5 million would go to the Vet Med Center. So that's kind of where we're at, and Appropriations wants us to look at those numbers. Do they make sense? Are we able to appropriate funds to both? So that's kind of what our task is as a committee. We can go into questions. Start with my Vice Chair, Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, President Linton. So 4 for the vet meds, 3.5 for 105. What do you think about those numbers?
I think we can make that combination work. It's a step forward, and I think that's what's most important. I think we're still going to have a tremendous impact with K-State 105, and we're going to work towards where I think we need to be as a College of Veterinary Medicine. So if you're asking if those numbers make sense where we can make it work, we can make it work because both are a very forward step in the right direction.
Representative Fairchild.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure who this question is for. Maybe it's just for the chairman, but if the Appropriations Committee wants to make this change and they think it's necessary, why can't they just do that on their own? And why are they asking us to look at this and to make the change?
I think it's because there was kind of a split in terms of legislative interest on what is a priority. There was discussion in appropriations, is K-State 105, are they duplicating some other efforts out there as it relates to economic development and small business development, those types of things. So we were just kind of tasked to go back and get some more information. They didn't ask us to make a formal recommendation, but I would like to take them some feedback from this committee. Vice Chair Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So President Linton, it would seem of the few things we've discussed here that the most pressing priority, at least from my perspective, is that there's no way you can afford to lose the accreditation of the veterinary school. I mean, out of everything, that seems to me to be the top priority. So why a more or less even split? Shouldn't there be more money for the vet med school, do you think? Or apparently you don't, so why don't you think that?
Yeah, I think when we went through our systematic approach to setting priorities, it was very difficult to be able to separate the two because one was critically important to the internal operation of the institution and the long-term reputation around animal health and diagnostics. But externally, and I think I had mentioned this in my testimony, that I've never seen an outreach and engagement program with so much impact and power to be able to create jobs and to be able to help create a better Kansas. And I think that's why in our process, we made the determination that K-State 105 was our #1 priority. But you make a great statement. It's very difficult to say that either is not important. You're right. If we don't have additional support for the vet school, long-term, there's lots of challenges relative to accreditation and our ability to be able to meet the promise of working with USDA, ARS, and our NBAF facility and BRI facility. That's how we came up with our ultimate set of priorities. We put the overall impact to the state of Kansas up front because of the strong impact that it's already had.
President Linton, if you could tell me a little bit more on the vet med side. We hear about potentially the need for more faculty to get those faculty numbers up because of the ratio is one of the lowest in the country. What do you need to get to for a faculty number? I've heard that we're okay with the faculty that we do have in different areas within vet med, but what is the overall faculty number that you're shooting for? And also, are we looking to increase the number of slots and for students? And if so, how much do the slots cost?
When you're talking about slots, you're talking about student slots?
Correct.
Yeah, I think one of our challenges, our student slots are really capped. What we're looking at doing is shifting from 60% out of state, 40% in state, to 60% in state, 40% out of state. And the reason we'd be able to make that shift with the additional dollars is the differential between out of state tuition and in state tuition. The only way that we can run the vet school now is to be able to have more out-of-state students so that we have those additional dollars coming in from a tuition perspective. So it's not really additional slots, it's changing the balance of the slots to be able to meet the needs of Kansans more so than the national need. And we don't have enough vets specifically in the state of Kansas, and we're not offering, I don't believe, the opportunities for Kansas residents to be able to get as many slots as they can in the vet school. So that's what's happening from a slot perspective. Relative to faculty numbers, if we really want to get to the aspirational goal to be a top 3 to top 5 vet school in the country, you're looking at another 40+ faculty lines over time. Again, this would be a small way and a very important step forward in heading in that direction.
So in terms of priority, I mean, and how you ramp something like this up, do you have to go increase the number of faculty first, then get more in-state students? I mean, I'm really looking for a number. It could be ballpark, what does it cost for, an in-state student slot? Like, is it?
I think I have that number. Just give me a second. Tuition differential is what's creating this differential, this pressure. It is $595 per credit hour for in-state versus $1,351 for out-of-state. So you can see that that differential is more than 2x. And we're trying to recapture that differential and use that as foundational support to be able to make the shift to be able to support Kansas residents.
Okay, just I wrote down the number is 595 for in-state and per credit hour and 1,351 for out of state.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Go to my ranking member, Representative Amix.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Dr. Linton. Question, and looking at maybe the long-term effect that it has. If we stay at the percentage difference of out-of-state versus in-state students, how many of the out-of-state end up staying in Kansas?
The answer is not nearly enough. I don't have that specific figure in front of me, and we can certainly provide it to you, but it's not nearly enough.
I guess I guess I'm looking at it from the standpoint of, that earning power and what they bring to the state.
Yeah, I think maybe to your question, I think the probability is a lot higher that if we increase the in-state student, our chances of keeping them in state are going to be considerably higher.
Next, we'll go to Vice Chair Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Are there any incentives to get your graduates to practice in rural Kansas in the vet med school?
Other than scholarship programs, there's no other specific incentives. And I think the scholarship programs are pretty limited.
So basically, no.
Not enough. Yeah, not enough.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We go to Representative Wagoner.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Litton, for being here. Sorry, I missed the first part. I still had some constituents in my office. I did want to ask, so, I mean, it has been concerning hearing about K-State's vet school, but this, losing your accreditation or whatever was sort of the negative, you say you're concerned about that, but what is the actual process? I mean, it's not like we're going to read a newspaper article next month that somehow it gets yanked. I presume you get put on probation. I mean, what is sort of what does happen when a school is having issues like K-State apparently is?
So that would be the first step. And I think I mentioned the other day, Oklahoma State University has just gone through this process. They're at 112 FTEs. We're at 113 FTEs. What makes Oklahoma State different from Kansas State is they didn't have enough of the boxes filled, rather relative to disciplinary effort. And so if you look at where K-State is with the limited amount of FTEs that are there, we are concerned that at some point in time, we're not going to be able to fill all the boxes like Oklahoma State couldn't, and that is a threat for accreditation. So in essence, it's better to have all of the boxes fully fed and then some in order to be assured that you're not close to that accreditation challenge. Right now, from a perspective of the people we have across multiple disciplines, we're in good shape, but losing a few faculty, and we've lost faculty, and we've talked about the loss in faculty at Kansas State University over the last several years. It's a real threat around the corner. So we would look to ensure that we balance all of those disciplinary areas to ensure that accreditation is not a risk. Does that make sense?
Somewhat. And so, but they haven't sent you some threat letter, have they? It's just, you're just kind of reading between the tea leaves between what happened to Oklahoma State University. Is that where you're going from this?
And it's a dean that is aware of where we are from an FTE perspective, and it's her job to be able to communicate the concerns. And that's where this original request came from when we had to ask the why and get the justification. It was the in-state versus the out-of-state balance and change and the need for faculty to ensure that we're not in risk of accreditation challenges.
Okay. One more question.
You have a follow-up, Representative Wagoner?
A question on K-State 105. I mean, I had somebody else who's not on this committee talk to me a little bit about this and was very skeptical about it. Just in the sense, you say it's one of your like #1 priorities. I guess I'm still the concern, and I think I mentioned this in an earlier committee meeting, just as far as like, mission creep, as far as, a state university or an ag university. This is not, you're not the Department of Commerce. I mean, the K-State 105, is that just somehow tied in through the, I mean, you have the extension service that is part of, I think, your mission. But I mean, again, this is a relatively recent, venture of K-State, and I'm just a little perplexed as to why it would be so critical to the college or university.
So I would say that economic growth and job creation is a core important value and strategy for any land-grant university. It's in the core of what we have done for a long time, and we typically have done it through cooperative extension and working with the university and working with stakeholders in the state. I think the difference is K-State 105, in a sense, utilizes our extension network and puts it on steroids to be able to focus on business development and partnerships, job creation, and economic growth. When we talked about what it is to become a next generation land-grant university, which is our aspirational goal in moving forward, we believe that our approach to economic growth and job creation with K-State 105 elevates our ability and extension to be able to make things happen for the state that we've never been able to do before. So it's just making bigger and broader and doing things in a different way. But again, the core value of any land-grant institution should always focus on job creation and making the economy better for the state.
And point of clarification, and so how much money do you currently spend on K-State 105? What's the totality of the funds that go from you folks?
It's $5 million.
Okay, that's the entire
annually.
budget for the whole operation.
It's the entire budget, and if you remember, the majority of that goes out into the counties and communities. I want to say roughly between 250 and to 300,000 stays in-house to be able to support the infrastructure. I think that's the other value creation of K-State 105. Not only is a minimal amount being spent in-house at the university, most of it's being pushed out to be able to help create our partnerships and grow them. But also in total, it's a 1-to-1 match that's coming back from our partnerships. So you're basically taking that $5 million and doubling its value. Yeah.
Next, we'll go to Representative Haskins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, President Linton, for coming back and giving us the information. have two questions, one in reference to accreditation, and maybe it's just a point of clarification. So I'm on the American Veterinary Medical Association's website, and you are listed as an accredited, and it looks like you were last evaluated in 2024, so you just accomplished that. Your next evaluation is 2031, and so typically, and we're experiencing this at Baker University because I oversee the school's accreditation for our business school, we have to give a status report. We have to provide information of they have concerns from the evaluation. Please work on that. That's how we want to see to progress. And so perhaps this status report or what concerns they have might be helpful for the committee, because often it is you don't have enough academically qualified research faculty to maintain the level of accreditation that you're pursuing.
We can absolutely provide that.
I think that would help.
I think it's a great point and a good question, because I really do think that helps to justify what we're asking for.
Because then you come back with the, like, okay, if we don't invest today, how much is it going to cost us 2 years from now? And that's where Oklahoma State is in peril. So it's just a suggestion. I would appreciate reading that. The other question with 105 is I'm going back to your presentation on slide 8. You talk about economic development. What would help me is, because I see where you're going with it, but you mentioned like your goal for the economic prosperity plan is to add 3,000 jobs and boost the Kansas economy by $3 billion by the year 2030. If that's your goal, where are we in that? Is it too soon? And is this K-State 105 the tool to be used to reach that goal?
I think it's an essential tool to reach that goal, and I don't have confidence that we'll reach that goal without K-State 105. Yeah, that goal was created and presented 5 or 6 years ago before I came on campus. And that's one of the reasons we created the thought process of K-State 105, was to be able to attain that pretty lofty goal.
And I've been open. I like the idea. I just think we need more information on the direct connection to your goal of economic improvement. And,
We just provided, just a few days ago, a report for the Kansas Board of Regents on economic development and impact. We could certainly take that information and provide it to you and make the direct connection about why K-State 105 was created, but it was created very purposely to be able to fulfill that goal.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Chair, I would appreciate receiving those reports if everyone's open to it. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yep. Thank you, Representative. We'd be glad to welcome any additional information. Vice Chair Sanders.
So the goal for job creation is 3,000, and as I recall from the slides, it was a little over 400.
Yep.
So what's the time frame for getting to 3,000?
By 2030 is the goal, but you have to consider that K-State 105 is one of the pieces in that puzzle. There's other pieces to that puzzle as well, where we're creating jobs. And I think if we provide, to his recommendation, the information and report that we just provided to the Kansas Board of Regents, it will help you understand all of the programs that are involved in economic growth and job creation.
So what are some of the other ones?
Work that's done with cooperative extension, traditional programs, work that's done in working with commerce to be able to attract companies to be able to come to the state of Kansas. Lots of other opportunities that we're involved in that help to be able to create economic growth and job creation. Again, to Representative Wagner's question and comment, economic growth and job creation has always been a part of what we try to do as a land-grant institution. K-State 105 just takes it to the next level. And job creation of 400 plus jobs, which I think was the data that I presented a few weeks ago, that's within 1 year of building a program from the ground up. Those are pretty strong job creation numbers that we expect to accelerate as time continues.
So I talked with an economic development guy in Salina several years ago. And he says the thing that people need to understand about EcoDevo is you hit a lot of singles. You very seldom hit a home run. Do you have any potential home runs out there?
Well, I'm a baseball guy. I'll tell you, you can score with singles and you can score with home runs. Our goal is to work on as many singles as we possibly can, and I think that's what K-State 105 does. And I think when you have success in singles, you have a better chance of hitting the home runs. And I think if we have a better systematic approach in place where people have confidence about the support that we can provide, chances are that a home run is much closer than if we don't have K-State 105.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you for the question, Vice Chair. I'm going to get into some more questions that I have, President. So as I studied the budget process and kind of what universities do internally, I've learned about, I guess, what is called responsible centered budget modeling, or maybe it's a term that's used on campus. As I understand it, perhaps the main campus at K-State charges some sort of fee to KSU Extension and K-State Vet Med to pay back part of their budget to the K-State main campus. Could you tell me a little bit more about that and what exactly K-State Extension and Vet Med contribute back to the main campus budget and what that's used for?
Yeah, it's a great question. I will say that I don't think that our budget model at Kansas State University has done what it has intended to do. We're in the process of completely reformulating the budget model in order to be able to provide incentives for all the things that are part of our strategic plan, whether it's excellence in instruction, research innovation, or engagement with our stakeholders, economic development, the things that are really important to us. Our current budgetary model is really based on student credit hours and the number of students. And that hasn't worked very well for us in a period of time where we had 8 years of declining enrollment. So with the creation of the new strategic plan, our budget model process is being completely changed to a model that's going to be more functional for the university. You did mention that as a part of the current RCM model that we have in place, that there's distribution that goes out and there's payments that come in order to be able to balance that budget. And with extension and with the vet school, those are two examples of those that have costs that come back into the budget. I don't have those exact numbers with me, but I think it's important that all of you know that the future budgeting of Kansas State University, I think, is working towards a much more purposeful way of doing things so that we can incentivize for excellence and reward for excellence.
President, would you be able to give us more specific numbers on what those costs are? Whether it's, because I believe it's in the millions of dollars. That goes back to.
I have a number here of 3.2 million for the vet school. My dean was supposed to be here, but it doesn't look like she's made it today to verify, but we can verify that number.
So 3.2 million would go from Vet Med revenues generated by tuition or other sources back to the main campus?
I think so, but without conferring with the dean to be sure, I'd rather be able to send that to you in a written form.
Okay.
To be able to make sure that we get that correct.
And how much would K-State Extension under that model?
I don't have that figure in front of me.
Okay. If you could provide that, I would certainly appreciate that, President Linton.
Do that.
So K-State Research and Extension for fiscal year 25 will receive $61.9 million in SGF. Is K-State Research and Extension, is it able to absorb the cost of doing a 105 initiative without additional appropriations?
If we did that, there'd be cuts across the system of a system that's already struggling for multiple years of budget cuts. We don't have what we need from a county support perspective. If we did, we would have strategically transitioned to be able to create K-State 105. It's because we didn't have the funding that we asked for appropriations 2 years ago. So to answer your question shortly, it would have significant impacts in all parts of the state relative to programs being limited or potentially dissolved. It would have a big impact.
So you mentioned previous cuts to extension, but when I look at the actual numbers for state general fund, it was less in 2024 than what's proposed in this year's budget. So it seems like it's increasing. So where specifically is it that you're referencing cuts being made?
I'm looking at a 10-year period and looking at the declining value from the state as well as from the counties. This is a county and state match, and also from the federal government. So if you take a look at cooperative extension, it's unique in that it has support federally, it has support from the state, and matching support from counties and communities, and collectively, that's where the significant decreases have been over time.
In terms of K-State research and extension, has there been any conversation about figuring out how to operate more efficiently with almost $62 million in state general fund appropriations, maybe less money from the counties? You know, are we able to sustain a model in which there's offices in almost every Kansas county? Is there a way forward, I guess, is what I'm asking you, because I think that's a conversation that other members have kind of had side conversations about. Can we sustain this model in the 21st century?
They're going through that process right now as we revitalized and created a new strategic plan for the university. So has engagement and cooperative extension holistically, and they're looking at trying to maximize the value of the resources that we have and our ability to be able to produce on programs that we've delivered for a long time, as well as being next generational in our thinking with programs like K-State 105. But again, when we envisioned this a couple of years ago and initially went through the process, we're thin from a cooperative extension perspective. This is the 5th university that I've worked in, and all other universities I had an extension role, and the support and the ability for us to deliver at the county level from a resource perspective per the population in Kansas versus other states that I've had limits us and challenges us. And I think we work through it every day to be able to try to be more efficient and try to deliver programs that are important for the future, and at the same time ensuring that we're not missing those critical programs that we've delivered for a long time.
So I guess I would be interested as chair of the budget committee to learn more about the relationship between the counties and the state. And, you know, if there's less county support, you know, I'd be curious to know what the threshold is of maintaining an office in a county and kind of what steps you would have to go through in those considerations. I've always been a little bit hesitant about K-State 105, just speaking quite frankly. You know, I look at it and the graphics are great. You know, the presentations are really well done. Your staff has done a good job of getting us the information. I just wonder, is that the role of a university or an extension system to be involved in economic development? And so that's a question I struggle with. And for instance, there's also conversation about, does this duplicate services that other entities provide? And for example, and I shared this with some folks last week, the Kansas Small Business Development Center ecosystem, it's largely funded by a federal grant to the state. I think it's most recent numbers I have are for 2023. It's a $47 million federal appropriation. And so you have all these different regions of the state that are set up for helping small businesses. Fort Hays State University actually receives that federal grant, and so they oversee the staff and the funding and kind of the managerial side of that. But it looks like on this map, it looks like maybe 15 different offices across the state. And looks like Washburn has the area that oversees Riley County, Shawnee County, Wabunsee, and kind of that part of northeast Kansas. I'm just wondering, what is it that K-State 105 does that they don't do? Or, are you duplicating services?
So I don't think we are. And the reason I say that is because of all the partnership and all the opportunities that have happened so quickly. And so maybe there's just more of a need for economic growth and development statewide that's been unfulfilled. Potentially some of that could be seen as duplicate. But it's surprised me about the relationships and the opportunities that have happened so quickly and related to job growth that we can document in a very short period of time. I think the difference that we play is our relationships in all 105 counties and communities, and our abilities to be able to network and partner with other universities, partner with other economic components of the state. I think that's the value that we bring because of our foundation of cooperative extension. That's what makes us unique, and that's what makes us different. That's why it's been so easy for us to make headwinds quickly.
So I appreciate that. And on your sheet about K-State 105, it says business and entrepreneurship support. There's 2.3 million of the 5 million that went to that. Then you got some matching funds to kind of leverage that initiative. But that seems to kind of duplicate what the Kansas Small Business Development Center does. Then you have technical assistance and workforce development. That seems a little bit more narrowed. I know in the presentation of Commerce, you had cited to a couple businesses where you provide really technical support and based off of the knowledge and expertise of your people. Maybe it was in your engineering department or other departments. So I see that as a little bit more of a
differentiator.
niche.
Yeah. No, I would agree. I think you make a good point. Our connection is not only with the 105 counties and communities, it's also connected with the 1,000+ faculty and their expertise on campus, which these other organizations are likely to have limited.
And again, I just struggle with some of this, what I perceive as maybe duplication, because here on the sheet, Seward County Development Corporation, Finney County Economic Development Corporation, Dodge City, Ford County Economic Development Corporation, you have Fort Hays State University, Innovation Center of Northwest Kansas, Wichita State University, Emporia State University, Washburn University, University of Kansas, Johnson County Community College, and Pittsburgh State University. So it seems like there's a lot of hands in the mix, but from a policymaker standpoint, it doesn't seem like we have a unified approach to solving some of these questions. So that's kind of, it's not personal against K-State. It's like, where's our united front on, business support, technical support and those types of things, because we have a Department of Commerce as well. There's a lot of hands in the bucket when it comes to EcoDevo. So I guess that was the point I was trying to make for the committee. We'll go to Representative Wagoner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. President Linton, one thing I'm also curious on this K-State 105. I mean, is this something that is K-State kind of the first out of the chute in doing this type of deal, or in Oklahoma or Iowa or Missouri or whatever? I mean, is this something all the land grant universities are somehow doing now, or what's the broader perspective?
I think our approach is somewhat unique and different than what other states have done. I know that other states in cooperative extension have economic development and job creation, and they do it successfully in other ways. But I really think the approach that we took relative to a statewide partnerships with all the entities that we describe is a pretty novel approach.
I think we'll have time for one more question. We'll go to Representative Haskins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, I feel like I'm just joining in to help clarify anything, but I'm now looking at the SBDC, and I've worked with the SBDC, and they have a more hyper focus on small business development, working with entrepreneurs. And President Linton, can you maybe give a little bit more detail, because in your presentation, sorry, I'm going to it. You focus on that K-State 105 actually will not only create and retain, but you focus on helping train employees within the organization. So while SBDC is more about entrepreneurship, you're trying to also focus on entrepreneurship within the organization. Or maybe I'm reading your slides wrong.
No, I think that is a long-term goal, as well as being a differentiator. The ability to be able to have hands-on training in certain areas of business development, but also have training early on in the process relative to what it takes to be successful in opening a business, and what are all the things that you need to think about fiscally, legally, in order to set people up to be more successful as they create that opportunity.
And I appreciate that. I would ask for you to revisit the latter part of that, because that does directly align with the goals of the SBDC. And so if we're looking at making an investment, I would look more into directly how can we grow companies, work with companies, and also focus on how public universities specifically have an obligation to make an impact in the community, and a state public university should make an impact across the state. And so that's how I see K-State 105. So thank you.
Thank you.
In closing, I just want to go over a few things, President Linton. So you had mentioned that you could continue to do K-State 105 at a lesser amount at the 4 million.
Yes.
So it's currently in appropriations, K-State 105 at 4 million and K-State Vet Med at 3.5. So 4 million, but long-term, do you see the ability through changes to the extension system overall that you could do this within the operating budget of extension?
I probably can't answer that question until we've had the opportunity to fully evaluate what that impact would be. When we looked at that a couple of years ago, we didn't believe that we would be able to do that with the program reductions that would have to be made and the staffing reductions that would have to be made.
And back on the vet med side of things, we talked about the responsible centered budget model, and it sounds like K-State University is trying to get away from that, but it wasn't clear to me, so could you?
We are. We have a new budget model process that we're going through this year. Again, to be much more intentional, to drive incentives that help support our strategic plan. Right now, that model focuses mainly on student credit hours and students as a way to be able to incentivize colleges. We're looking to transition that to include most of the elements that are associated with the strategic plan, to drive a strategic plan to incentivize for excellence and to reward when we're moving the university forward. And I think especially with a College of Veterinary Medicine, it's challenging because cooperative extension and the College of Veterinary Medicine are quite often on their own islands from a budgetary model perspective at other places that I've been, because of the challenges that it presents. So as an example, since there's a cap for College of Veterinary Medicine students, they can't increase their numbers. They can't be incentivized for what the budget model was based around. And so as we go through this evaluation, we're going to have to make sure that we can hold strong and steady programs like cooperative extension and programs like the College of Veterinary Medicine to be able to provide the incentives so that all colleges can be successful. I believe they are at a disadvantage in our current budgetary model.
So is this budget model, does that have to be approved by KBOR, or what are some of the constraints? Do you have freedom to do that?
It has to be approved by all of my administration and my deans, so wish me luck on that one.
Okay, so
But that's the process we're using.
so that happens this spring for the next academic year or the next fiscal year, I guess?
We're hoping to have it implemented by next July 1 is the hope. It's the goal.
July 26?
Of this year coming up, at least in if worst case scenario, in a probational year. So lots of times when you completely change a budget model, you run it through the system the first year to evaluate its effectiveness. But that's the hope, that's the goal.
So if the legislature appropriates 3.5 million for the vet med, and as I understand it, in the current budget model, you sweep about 3.2 million to the main campus from vet med. So what assurances does the legislature have that any appropriation dedicated to vet med wouldn't be swept through the existing budget model?
I don't know that I can answer that question specifically, but I think a different question that I can answer will give you the assurance. I think the College of Veterinary Medicine is going to be much more fairly represented with a new budget model. And I think that's what's important for you to know so that we can utilize this opportunity to incentivize them, enable them to grow because of these incentives as a part of the strategic plan.
Okay. Well, thank you. I appreciate your time and answering all the questions and hearing some feedback as well. So President Linton, thank you for being here. Did you have anything else you'd want to leave with?
I just want to check on my homework assignments. So one is to get the accreditation report back to you. The second is to be able to get the budget implications for economic prosperity and to be able to make a connection with K-State 105. Then there was a third piece too. What was the third piece?
Representative Haskins?
Yeah, it was a distinction between SBDC and K-State 105. You know, how do you complement each other? And just for the the sanity of the committee, if instead of getting the full accreditation report, if it could be an executive summary highlight, because
we
don't wanna
could
go down
probably
that road.
provide you with the summary, the executive summary.
That would
And if you
be-
need more information, we can give it to you.
yeah, we do not, so.
And then also validating the figure for RCM to ensure that I was correct. I've got that number here, but I'd feel much more confident validating that with the dean of the college.
Okay, and that was also information about how much under the current model goes to, from extension to main campus, and I think maybe K-State Salina, maybe Olathe. I don't know if they're affected, but if they are, I'd be kind of curious to see how they're affected. With that being said, I know there's a lot of talk and conversation amongst people in the House and the Senate that they really want to see vet med and the animal health corridor succeed. And trying to get more slots for in-state students that are eligible to go in-state rather than out-of-state to pursue their career, so they can hopefully live and work and stay in Kansas for years to come. So thank you, President Linton, for being here, and I wish you well as you continue your semester.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity today and appreciate your support of Kansas State. Thank you.
Okay, next, I would like to welcome to the podium Dr. Blake Flanders, President and CEO of the Kansas Board of Regents, to give us an overview about all that goes into producing a budget and coming up with some of those base numbers for the Regent institutions.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Howe and members of the committee. We have just a quick PowerPoint here I'll let them bring up. I've brought a couple of experts with me that are going to assist me in the presentation that really can spend some time on the details of how the distribution was arrived at and where we're going with that. And that is Kelly Oliver and Elaine Frisbee. So at that time, I'll just yield the podium to them if that's okay, and then they can go ahead through that part of it. Next slide. I do want just to remind that our regents govern 6 state universities, coordinate 32 public institutions. We administer the financial aid programs, the retirement system, and we regulate the private out-of-state institutions. Now, I think there's some question on the private colleges. So we do not have a governing, coordinating, or regulating relationship with the independent colleges. Sometimes they're referred to as the private colleges, but they're nonprofit. So when we talk about the private out-of-state institutions, it's more like a University of Phoenix as opposed to Tabor or Bethany. So I just wanted to make that distinction because it is a difference. Next slide. If you look at the timeline of the Board of Regents, we are 100 this year, and we're really excited about that. But in 1999 is when there was a seminal moment that the legislature, through Senate Bill 345, really recreated and created the modern Board of Regents. And some of you may remember that. I remember the first discussions and people saying, well, this will take at least 10 years, and then it happened really in one session. So it was really exciting. And what that did is moved the community colleges and the technical colleges underneath the board in a coordinating fashion. And Washburn University was also coordinated by the Board of Regents, but kept their own governing boards. And then it continued governing the state universities. Now, why was that? Why did that happen? Well, the legislature wanted one voice for higher ed in the legislature, and really didn't want all of the sectors lobbying for their own things. And so they asked the board to submit, which we do, a unified budget for higher education. So we have technical colleges, community colleges, Washburn University, and all the state universities come to the board. We have those discussions during a retreat at the September board meeting. We approve a budget, a unified budget that we submit to you. And that was a principal factor, was that there was one voice for higher education. Other things on that timeline that I think are important is in 2007, there was some concern from the legislature that career and technical education wasn't getting enough attention, and that we were really falling behind in terms of creating a workforce for some of those occupations that are typically known as the trades. And also included in that were really non-baccalaureate level, perhaps nursing and certified nurse aide, certified med aide positions as well. And so they created the Post-Secondary Technical Education Authority that worked underneath the Board of Regents. And through that, and also asked at the time, not asked, but actually decreed at the time, that we take a different look at vocational schools. And so those schools used to be attached. Some were governed by school district boards. Some had their own boards. But what the legislation required is that you either went back to the school district permanently and was governed by the school district, or you became a technical college and were a standalone technical college. And I believe Salina Area Technical College opted for that. You merged with another institution, and some actually merged. That was, I believe that would be Northeast Kansas Technical School merged with Highland Community College. We'd also had several successful mergers throughout the state, or you could affiliate with another institution. And that happened right here in Topeka, where the Kaw Area Technical School actually affiliated with Washburn University and became Washburn Tech at the time. And so that was really an important time. And then through Senate Bill 143 and through legislation, we developed a funding formula for those institutions. And I believe Elaine Frisbee will take you through that. And then last year, you also enacted the blueprint. Next slide. So what does coordination mean? We actually have those robust discussions every day on what coordination means. Obviously, governance means that we hire the university president. The state universities are actually state agencies, so they're comply with state laws and they follow our board policy. The institutions that are coordinated that have their own board policy. Washburn, one of them, which, by the way, the Board of Regents has a seat on the Washburn Board of Governance. And then the local area trustees for the community colleges have their own board policy as well. The community colleges have elected boards because those boards have taxing authority. The technical colleges do not have, those are appointed boards, and they do not have local taxing authority. So we have performance agreements for each institution as required, I believe, by Senate Bill 647. We develop a comprehensive plan for coordinating all program and course offerings. As an example of that, we now have a system-wide core general education that's the same across the community colleges and universities, which facilitates transfer. Again, we talked about the unified budget. We are the entity tasked with representing the entire system before the governor and the legislature. And then one really important function is our agency really collects data and is focused on data reporting and can be of real assistance as you have questions, as parents and students have questions about programs. In fact, we have a website called ks.gov that has every individual program, how much people borrowed to go through that program, how long that program took them to complete, and what their wages are after they completed and were employed, how many are employed in Kansas, and what their wages are 5 years after they began initial employment. So it really gives parents and students the kind of information I think everybody wants to see in terms of what are the outcomes for these programs. Next slide. With that, I'm going to ask Kelly Oliver to come forward and talk a little bit about how different institutions of higher ed and the Board of Regents receive their state fund and how that distribution is. But I want to just, right before that, want to talk about one thing. I think you've seen some charts on how much dollars per FTE. I want to tell you that it was difficult to develop a funding formula for the two-year colleges, right? Because some receive some local money, some do not. But it does not compare, it pales in the complexity to the differences between a research university and a regional university and a community college. As an example, all community colleges essentially award similar degrees. In other words, they might have different technical degrees, which we account for in our formula by different tiers, but they all have the Associate of Arts. They all have the Associate of Science. They're all supplying that type of education. The technical colleges have Associate in Applied Sciences. They don't have as broad a mission, but that education is similar. As you look at a research university versus, let's just say, a regional university or a community college, what kind of funding streams do you count against the FTE? Okay, so if you put money in the University of Kansas budget for the Law Enforcement Training Center, should that count against the FTE if they don't take college credit? If you put dollars in for the Kansas Geological Survey, that really does all the core sampling for the water across the state, which is part of the mission of that university, but really doesn't have any students. Should those dollars count against an FTE? You know, that's just a question. So what I'm trying to say is we're going to try to supply you additional information in that area that has some of those things broken out, just so that you can see that. But it really is a difference on just taking the standard FTE and doing the division and not knowing that there's several different areas of that mission that may or may not be traditional baccalaureate delivered education. So with that, I'll just go ahead and turn the podium over to Kelly Oliver.
President Flanders, before you leave, just wanted to ask, will you be available to answer questions at the conclusion of the presentation?
I do have some testimony at 3:30, but I would be able to.
Okay.
If it depends on how late the hearing goes.
Sure. We'll try not to go too late. Thank you and welcome to.
Thank you. Kelly Oliver with the Board of Regents office. Next slide, please. Just talk a little bit about some background related to how we receive our appropriations. As you know, as state agencies, the Board of Regents office and the state universities receive direct appropriations from the legislature. Some of those appropriations for the state universities do pass through our office, though. Next slide. In addition to that, for our office, we receive then appropriations for other higher education institutions, so the community colleges, technical colleges, and Washburn. Since they are not state agencies, their funding flows through our office, and you appropriate those funds to us. So for Washburn University, they receive their operating grant, capital projects, community colleges, and technical colleges, as Elaine will talk about in a little while, receive tiered and non-tiered funding. And then, as Blake mentioned, we don't serve a role with the private independent colleges in Kansas, but we do have student financial aid programs in our office that funding flows through to them. Next slide, please. Blake mentioned Senate Bill 345, the original vision for that. He talked a little bit about the unified budget, the performance, and creating a policy agenda for higher education. That bill also included state funding that was to occur for both for the entire system of higher education. So both for the state universities, for the community and technical colleges, and for Washburn University. Part of that funding for the state universities was to be faculty salary enhancements. That was a focus of that. In addition, for the community and technical colleges in Washburn, it was to amp up their or increase their funding to get it to more of a regional university average. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the university funding. Prior to 2002, the universities operated on a general use budget model. So that model was in that there was an overall amount for each university set, whether or not it was funded from state general fund or tuition revenue. Those two funding sources were interchangeable, where if a university was able to generate tuition revenue above what they had projected, typically in some fashion, their state general fund amount would actually decrease the amount that was going to that institution. Likewise, if an institution was not able to generate the tuition revenue that was projected, they would receive additional state general fund. In 2002, that model changed, where we moved to a tuition ownership model and an operating grant model for the state universities. Under the tuition ownership model, those universities, you'll see in the second graph, were able to retain any and all tuition revenue that they generated above what they might have estimated. If they had enrollment growth, if they had a change in their enrollment mix, they were able to keep that revenue. Likewise, if they had a decrease in enrollment, that also was a hit to the university, and it was not backfilled with state general fund appropriations. Next slide. So with the state university operating grants, the focus of that was that the universities would receive a base amount and would be increased year over year. That amount would be appropriated to the Board of Regents office, and then the Board of Regents office worked with the state university to create an allocation formula for the state operating grants. Those operating grants distributions only happened a handful of years in the very beginning following the 2002 year. In those years, the amounts that were distributed to the universities were based on a base amount went to all, but then there were also adjustments given to certain universities. So whether it was a regional university or a special mission campus such as a medical center, or as you were hearing earlier about extension and research, because those campuses did not have the ability to generate as much tuition revenue as, say, for instance, KU and K-State did. Next slide. Currently, though, over the years, we've moved to where we have a model of that it's really a pretty much a base plus model. The operating grant happened, like I said, for a few years, but then now, as we are now, we have a base plus where an institution may receive an increase that is just on top of what they're currently receiving, or there are very, as you know, very different appropriations for special allocations or special missions or special initiatives that might be happening at that campus. For instance, you have an example of Fort Hays on this slide. You will see that they receive, yes, operating expenditure appropriations, but they also receive funding for the Kansas Academy for Math and Science and for other initiatives that might be occurring at their campus. At this point, I'm going to hand it off to Elaine, who will talk further about Washburn and the two-year sector.
Thank you, Kelly. I appreciate the information. Welcome back to the committee, Elaine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Elaine Frisbee, Vice President for Finance and Administration. I'm going to talk a little bit more now about the coordinated institutions, and then we'll wrap it up and open it for questions. So the municipal university is often referenced in appropriation language, which we're essentially talking about Washburn, which is, of course, only one of 3 municipal universities in the country. So Washburn, since the adoption of Senate Bill 345, and even prior to that, has had a line item in the Board of Regents budget. And even though there was a vision for there to be a funding formula for how they get their state aid, in practice, it has essentially been to how much the extent to which the university has lobbied and advocated for more funding and had success with the legislature. So in fiscal year 23 and 24, Washburn received an operating grant of $14 million, which was bumped up in 25 for 14.27. And the line item there you see is just taken from our appropriation bill. Next slide. So the whole question that's come up recently, particularly with regard to Fort Hays State University, there was a discussion last spring. Let's go back to last spring when the Board of Regents had its meeting with the Regents, and the campus handed this slide out to the Regents just to spark this conversation where they wanted to raise concern, and I think they've raised concern now with many legislators this year and with the Board of Regents about their relative levels of state funding compared to their peers, the other 5 universities. And so many years now have lapsed since the time 1999, and we had Senate Bill 345, and how the whole funding formula has evolved or devolved. And so wanted to have the opportunity to talk to you a little bit about this. Let's go to the next slide. So then the next step after last spring's meeting, in the budget workshop that we held for the Board of Regents in late July, back in Wichita, we started to generate some material, and the little box there up on the upper left-hand side was intended to give Regents just a sense for state and local revenue per FTE student. In order to get comparable data for all of our sectors of public institutions, we have to turn to a source called IPEDS. IPEDS is the federal data source that all of the public institutions submit similar data to. Because it's a federal source, there is quite a time lag. So 2022 was the most recent information that we had. More recently, we've generated another table down at the bottom right-hand corner that just shows the state universities for fiscal year 2024. If you were to look at just their operating expenditure appropriation, if you think back to that slide that Kelly was referencing for Fort Hays has a line item for operating, and each university does, but then they might have specialty items for their campus, unique. So excluding all those specialty items and focusing only on their operating appropriation, and then looking at their Kansas resident FTE, and then comparing that on an FTE basis, what do those numbers look like for fiscal year 2024? Because of the model that Kelly described for you over that whole time period from 1999 to the present, Fort Hays, and I think President Mason talked to you a little bit about this, They had 20 years of enrollment growth in that timeline of tuition ownership. So if you think back to that slide where the tuition, the ability for the university to generate tuition and keep it was capped, but then that was lifted and the state funding and the tuition funding was decoupled. And so those revenues that were generated at Fort Hays from student tuition, they had the benefit of those dollars. But conversely, they did not receive any state funding to coincide with supporting those students either. So I think that's sort of what helped propel us to this day. Let's go to the next slide. So I'd want to talk just a little bit as a contrast then from the universities to think about the two-year colleges. In 2011, Blake referenced in that timeline, Senate Bill 143 said, let's create a new tiered technical education formula. And it was intended to identify the college's direct and indirect expenses to deliver courses that are for academic credit to Kansas resident students. So it's not meant to address what colleges have to spend for non-resident students, nor is it for their student unions, auxiliaries, residence halls, dorms, athletics, those sorts of things. One feature of the model that is of benefit, there are inflationary adjustments applied throughout the model. So as their costs increase, that is recognized in the formula. We can go on to the next slide. So how are instructional costs calculated in that model? There are 4 pieces of the pie. First, we'll talk about the 3 slices that are in blue, because those are fundamental to all of the courses that the colleges deliver. So if you're teaching a non-technical course, think English composition, American history, you're going to have an instructor who receives a salary, some wages, their benefits. You're going to have the college's indirect costs, the colleges for those expenses for things like instructional support. You've got a student advisor, you've got a financial aid office, you've got a bursar's office. You're also going to have institutional support costs. And you're going to have a president's office, you're going to have a physical campus you have to take care of, the physical plant. Those 3 things together form the bulk of what we spend for the formula. So those 3 things are added up. And when you have a technical course, so you're teaching a welding class, a carpentry course, you're going to have some extraordinary costs. Something like you're going to have to buy consumables. Maybe for a nursing class, you're going to have to buy gloves, latex gloves, whatever it might be. So combining those technical courses then with the non-technical expenses, you get to some courses, some course costs. We take all 10,000 courses we have in the system from all the 26 colleges, and we aggregate all that data up. And that's how we get to course rates for each of the classes. Go to the next slide. So over 10,000 courses are grouped into 685, and then in those 685 groupings, they are then bucketed into the different tiered rates that you see on this slide. And this is really just to demonstrate that back in 2011 to 2024 AY, which is our most recent year, our costs generally have, and across all the tiers, have grown in excess of 50, 55, 58%. So there has been that recognition over time for our course cost delivery has grown, the expenses have grown across the colleges. If we go to the next slide, we talk a lot about tiered courses, and the delivery of those technical courses incredibly important for meeting our workforce needs, but nearly 71% of the academic courses delivered by our 2-year colleges are non-tiered. They are non-technical, your general transfer type courses across the system. And those technical courses generated $171.7 million of the expenses across the most recent year. 155 million of that for the community colleges and 16.7 million of that for the technical colleges. So if you think of all the courses at all the 26 schools added up together, most of the courses are going to be found with just 3 elements, and you can see the pie chart there. The most recent year for a non-tiered course, for every credit hour, an instructor is going to be $345. The instructional support, $159, and the institutional support, $195. So you add all those up across the entirety of the system. Now that's talking about the expense side of the ledger. On the next slide, we talk about the revenue side of the ledger. So the cost model also addresses how those costs are to be funded. And it depends on the student how those are funded. So in the cost model, for a community college in-district student, so a student from within Butler County attending Butler County Community College, they are to generate 1/3 student tuition. That credit hour is then supposed to be 1/3 from the Butler Community College's property tax and 1/3 from the state. For the community colleges, for their students who are from outside the taxing district, and for all technical college students, because they don't have the mill levy, it's 1/3 student, 2/3 from the state. That does not mean then that the tuition rate is supposed to be 1/3 of what the state rate is. But in the model, the concept is the state share of the expense is calculated on the assumption that students will fill in a certain amount and the property tax will fill a certain amount, and the rest is state aid. If you are a high school student in Senate Bill 155 from 2012, commonly referred to Excelling CTE, it is 100% state funded. So the schools cannot charge tuition for those students. Go on the next slide. So the cost model was implemented fiscal year 2011, it's 2011 Senate Bill 143, but it was many years, more than 10 years before it was fully adopted. For a number of years, there were budget provisos enacted, here's an example from 2012, 2013 Senate Bill 171, the appropriation language that told us at the Board of Regents that basically we should give everybody roughly the same amount they got the prior year. And if there is a reduction in the funding, everybody gets prorated down the same rate. So there were many years where the state funding, even though we calculated the state funding every year for what the 1/3 or 2/3 cost was, or 100%, we didn't always have the funding to pay for that. There was a gap in the funding. And that's the annual gap report that we generated for the legislature and the Tech Ed Authority every year, describing that shortage. We'll go on to the next slide. It wasn't until 2022, the legislature then launched us on a path to recenter state aid over 3 years and fully adopt the cost model and not have that gap anymore. So in 2022, there was language applied in our appropriation language that explained over the 3 years how that would go. So in that first year, if you were going to get less state aid because your enrollment dropped, then we were going to give you half back. You're going to be held harmless. The second year, you got half of it back. And then the last year, that third year, we fully adopted the cost model. So you are now, as a college, fully funded in your tiered and your non-tiered funding according to your cost calculations, using a 3-year rolling average. So I hope that's clear. It took us several years of fully implementing the cost model after many years of not having it fully funded. And that did take additional funding for us to get there. So the amount for tiered and non-tiered is $155 million in 2026, which is almost 9.8% higher, almost 9.8% higher than it was just in 2022. So there are additional funds that have been added. And I'm going to stop there. I think Blake gave you kind of the entree to thinking about the many years that it took for us to get where we are from 1999. There are certainly many things that would need to be taken into consideration if the legislature were to encourage the board or try to seek a funding formula for the universities. What are the goals for serving resident students, just like you spoke about the ks.gov med. So lots of things to think about there.
Thank you again for the information. It's a lot of information to absorb, and I think we all have handouts of the presentation as well now, so we can review that on our own time. But I guess we'll be ready for questions from members of the committee. So I guess you can ask for any of the presenters from K-More to answer a question. We'll go with Representative Sawyer.
Thank you. I'll ask you the question. Page 14, your chart showing operating expenditure appropriation and then operating expenditure per FTE. Can you kind of explain to us what that shows? The significance of that chart?
So I think, thank you, Mr. Chair, if I may. I think, Representative, that speaks to the variety of level of subsidy, the extent to which different institutions are subsidized by the state, and that has evolved in a way that does not relate to any funding formula or intent. There has been no particular intention at funding at an FT level for the universities. That has not, except for the original vision of Senate Bill 345, which was never really adopted, that is just not how the universities have been supported by the state legislature. So just looking at funding per FTE student, it can be an interesting metric to look at, but in and of itself isn't going to help you really understand all the different finances of each institution.
So this chart, when you say operating expenses per FTE, what is it showing us?
So Emporia is listed first, being first alphabetically. So in 2024, fiscal year 2024, they received $38.7 million appropriation. They had 2,558 Kansas resident FTE students. So their headcount students converted on a full-time basis. And they had $15,000, $130 compared to them, given to them appropriated on an, but again, their funding was not appropriated to them on that basis.
That's the way it worked out.
That's the way it worked out.
So when you use this chart, obviously the Veterinary Medical Center and the KU Med Center, those are very expensive, but you take those two out, then we're spending more per student at Emporia State. It's like Pittsburgh State is the second highest. Fort Hays is still less, but it's a lot closer. I mean, it's almost the same as Wichita State. So
Going all the way back to the 1990s, which is quite a while, their funding, so think of Emporia State and Kansas State University, just their base operations, not all those other maybe capital or other type appropriations. Their funding, their budget was calculated very precisely. So they were given a certain amount for salaries and every employee's benefits, and the state share was calculated very precisely. And then their other operating expenses were also, maybe you'll get a little bit because you had a new building added, and so we're going to give you some servicing new buildings to keep up that building. Everything was done very precisely. And again, as the Board of Regents increased tuition or they had some success with enrollment, then the state general fund was floated up or down to hit that total. So there was a backstop there with state funding. And so depending at that point in time, depending on your enrollment and what was happening with tuition, and at that point, we even had standard tuition rates. So KU and K-State were at the same tuition rate. They were all the same. So everything was very mathematically precise and done in a very particular way. Then the tuition ownership model came, and it was more Regents universities, state universities, you go figure your own operations out, but we will give you support for certain things, faculty pay being one of them. So the vision was there, it's in about 345, but we didn't quite always get all the way to implementing it with the funding on the backside. And so over time now, as the board has limited the universities on tuition, what they can do with tuition rate increases, and where they've seen drops in enrollment, then of course that's going to change these numbers quite a bit.
Next, we'll go to Ranking Member Amix.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Elaine, thank you. As I look at all of these different graphs and charts and all this stuff, which one, and this goes back to the information that we received last week in one of the budget hearings, which one of these tells me or shows me a more apples to apples comparison into like SGF that we give?
Honestly, Representative, Mr. Chairman, I would struggle to say that anything that's been presented so far is really the ideal apples to apples comparison. I think given some time, we could certainly have broader conversations. When the model was put together for the two-year schools, I think that was a 2 or 3 year process that involved the institutions and their CFOs, and a lot of input from the CEOs. It didn't just happen. Some staff person came up with an idea and ran with it. So I think if there were serious interest in seeking a remedy for developing a formula, we would want time and a lot of broad input on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I doubt I have 2 to 3 years left, but no, all I'm trying to do is make sure that I am making those comparisons so that when we make decisions on what level of the funding is going to be to the various universities and different schools, I want to make sure that we're doing it right. That's all it is. And I appreciate all the information, but something tells me I'm missing something, and I'm not sure what it is. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, the response I would have to that, Representative, is in the context of where we are now in 2024, last summer, when the board was reviewing the universities and the colleges' requests for funding for the 26 budget, they were looking at those requests in the context of where we are now, and they made decisions and priorities in presenting forth to the governor, to you, what their request is. And so that list of proposals that you see before you in Brianna's materials and what Blake presented to you, that's really what the board at this point is trying to achieve.
Next, we'll go to Vice Chair Sanders, then we'll go to Representative Haskins after that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is for Dr. Flanders. So after hearing the presentations by the regionals last week, I came away with a sense that I had prior to that anyway, that the regionals and for that matter, the community colleges don't feel that they're fairly funded relative to the big three. Do you agree with that? And if so, what's your response?
Yeah, so I would tell you that I have never heard that from the community colleges, period. And I'd say community and technical colleges because they're in the same formula. That formula at present, if you keep up with it, is fully funded. And so I just have not heard that. Now, what I have heard as we develop that formula, and it sounds like there's interest in developing a formula, as we developed that formula, we did all that development and we went 10 years before it was implemented. So why did that happen? Because this body did not want to implement it because it would have taken money from some institutions and moved it to others, and I get it. So if someone in your district said, hey, we're going to lose a couple $100,000 out of this formula, that's why the stop was put on. In terms of the regionals, I do think there is some sense out there that the regionals believe that they need to receive more funding because their recruiting footprint is smaller and they're not able to generate the same amount of dollars through tuition as maybe the larger research universities. You know, just candidly, in terms of that same model as we tried to implement the two-year college formula, you know, really we've seen a lack of interest, honestly, from policymakers to add any funding to the base amount. So as funding's been received for the universities, it's typically came in the form of special projects. So in other words, today I even noticed you were debating whether or not to add to K-State 105, whether or not to add to the vet school. We've had one thing we've been very successful with is the student playbook, but that was a specific allocation. But in terms of adding to the base budgets, we haven't seen the interest in that. And as we develop a formula, and I think that's something that there's interest in, that will be a component of that because it's very hard to move money.
Do you think that the regionals would like to go back to the way it was prior to 1999?
You mean without tuition owner?
Yes.
Oh, you mean they were underneath the Board of Regents at that time, but in terms of decoupled tuition, you know, I don't know. I would need to ask them on that specifically. I would say that as the reason that tuition was decoupled is, number one, I think university presidents at the time wanted to be incentivized for growth. And at the time, if you grew and got more tuition revenue, then your state allocation actually came down. So you weren't incentivized for that. But I think too, I think policymakers, legislators might have seen a longer term horizon of saying, we're not going to be able to fund this system at a formulaic level of what it needs to be funded at. And so we need you to be more entrepreneurial to increase your dollars through tuition.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Next, we'll go to Representative Haskins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Ms. Oliver? Thank you for your testimony, and I believe you covered this in your presentation on Senate Bill 345 in 1990, and President Flanders pretty much answered it, but I want to give you the opportunity here. It seems like there was good intentions with this vision. Now that we know what we know, do you feel that there is the opportunity to revisit this vision and perhaps revisit the funding model, or is it just we need more time, or how do you feel about that?
I would say that I don't know that it's this vision at this point in time, since we've moved, 25 years.
Right.
Yeah, 25 years since this time. I think it's something that looking at funding for the state universities could be something that would be looked at. And as we've mentioned, there's lots of factors that we could include in that funding model, which would be for a request for funding and also a distribution in funding. Do you incentivize, do you want to use state funds for just resident students? Do you want to look at all students? Do you want to look at some student success metrics? All kinds of things that we could look at in some type of distribution model. But I think it's something that we would want to have, as has already been mentioned, a wide look and a wide brush of different all the institutions and individuals having input into that.
Okay, thank you. And I believe you handed the ball off when it came to state aid operating grants to Ms. Frisbee, or did you?
We talked about that.
Of course you did. That was a test. That was one of my questions. Good job on that. All right. So, and we'll just carry on with the rankings questions, and as well as my representative from Wichita on that slide 14, in which we kind of get to the nuts and bolts. Like if you're going to compare it, you got to compare it with with operating funds. And so now I want to go back to slide 11, just for clarification. On when on those slides that we're comparing operating grant funds or SGF funds related to FTE on that slide 14 or whatever it was, and I'm looking at 11, you give the example of Fort Hays. I see the operating expenditure is $38.5 million. And then there's that regional stabilization fund of $3 million. And that $3 million is not included in the calculation for FTE based on that other slide. It's just that 38.5. Because that would be like what President Flanders said, is like, that's an additional fund to help. Or is it included?
Mr. Chair, it is not included, correct? Okay, I just want to double check. It is not included in this calculation on slide 14. That's one way to look at it.
Right.
Should it be included? Should that be part of a base if we want to do some comparison on FTE basis? Should that be included or not? When we did operating grant distributions to institutions previously, there were some special appropriations that were included in that base that we looked at for distribution purposes. But I think going forward, we would want to take a look at each line in each institution to decide that.
And that sounds like a good direction. So thank you. And one last question, Mr. Chair, and that's for the President Flanders. Thought you were going to get away. Okay, so I want to follow up a little bit about the questions that's being asked when it comes to how we move forward. And this is just more of a comment. Is first year on this, first 4 weeks, it does seem like we need to have some degree of benchmark, because we get one side coming saying that we're not fully being funded, and the other side saying we are. And you give a good example, like if the baseline is going to be FTE, we're going to have to be consistent with SGF because everything's add-on. So that's just a comment that I wanted. But we took money away from a very important project, Blueprint Literacy, and I wanted to give you the opportunity to maybe tell us how that would have impacted the other universities in the budget as we see moving forward.
So we would not have counted the Blueprint funding in the base allocation because it's a separate fund. I would say that it just in terms of policy, and this would just be a disagreement, that we've gotten new numbers now from NAEP. 40% of the students aren't reading at grade level. So we're spending half the state budget over here for 10 million. We can make an attempt, whether or not it, like time will tell if it's going to be effective. But right now, we're going to be satisfied with 40% of the students not reading at grade level. And I would tell this committee, because I really believe it, it's one of the largest economic threats for Kansas growth and an economic threat for the individual as well. Because if you can't read, you're not going to be able to participate in this economy.
And that 10 million is going to Kansas Board of Regents, but for the committee to know, I met the President Flanders when I was at the Kansas State Department of Ed, and it was my job to come over and collaborate with, specifically in tech ed. Can you talk a little bit more about how you're not doing this alone? You're also in partnership with KSDE to help like hand the ball off to help them improve.
Sure. So when the legislature approved those funds, in the legislation, it was required that we hire staff to do that, a director, and then it was required to develop a plan for centers, okay? So there was some question about, should those funds have been recurring? Well, if the legislation calls for you to hire staff and to set up a network of centers, you would likely think that's more than 1 year, but that was the legislation. We believe that there's no funding that's forever. It's evaluated every year. And so what we do is the Board of Regents doesn't get to keep all those funds. Those go out to the universities. We have actually individuals from the State Department of Education who are on the Literacy Advisory Committee advising that director on how to do that. Now, it's going to take all of us. They have trained some faculty, or teachers rather, and have used the letters training. That's a theoretical base. But if we're really going to make the advancement, I think we'd all agree that we need a network of coaches. We need the work of those centers. And this is going to take all of us to solve this situation that I think is of grave concern.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, President Flanders.
Thank you for the question. I do have some questions. I know people got 3:30 meetings and you've got testimony you need to provide to another committee as well. But the cost model, is it not incremental budget? Isn't it an incremental budget model? Is that the same thing? To where the base comes back every year, then you can add to it.
So it would, so not quite, because what we do is we make an assessment of costs each year. And so costs can actually go down if you spend less. But we have created a policy that we're not going to drop the cost. So as an example, we had a blip one year where people actually spent less on their nursing dollars, probably because of the COVID piece. And so then it came in, or their nursing programs rather. So then it came in that we needed to reduce the cost supplied to nursing programs. And as we talked to institutions and saw that was a one-time anomaly, we just said, well, we're not going to increase that, but we're not going to decrease those costs. Now, we have decreased costs in other areas, but it seemed at the time with the situation we were in as a country and as a state, we didn't need to be decreasing those dollars at the time. So it's not really incremental, although typically with inflation, as you can imagine, instructors would get paid a little more and then those costs would increase.
So, is the board considering going to a zero-based budget model at all? Is that coming under consideration just as a kind of a way to reset and encourage efficiencies and trying to build those budgets from the ground up?
The state actually has a zero-based budget. What we've done is use performance agreements rather than that model. What's real difficult from delivery of higher education is to say, with zero-based, you start out with assumption of what are we going to do and what are we not going to do. And it can get really difficult in terms of dropping services. So if you did that at the med center, okay, let's just take that as an example. They might say, well, our most expensive campuses are in Wichita and Salina. So what we would do is we just say, well, we're just going to be in Kansas City, and that's going to be our model. When in terms of service, we need more docs perhaps in the rural areas, and so that's what that does, even though from a cost-effective standpoint, if you just looked at that budget, it'd be more expensive.
Okay, thank you for that. And my last question is, do you agree there is a disparity between the regionals and the big three? And if so, what is the Board of Regents prepared to do to address that?
Yeah, so I don't think it's between the regionals and the big three. I think there's differences with all of them. And if I pulled some more of the complexity out of this budget, I think you'd find, as an example, on the one chart, you saw one of the regionals was actually funded at a higher FTE than some of the research universities. So we can use an iPad's chart that's more of a blunt instrument that just folds everything in together. And what it would do is, I'm going to take the University of Kansas, for example. It would take the med center and drop into the budget of undergraduate education. And what we know is that comparison's just really invalid. So I think as we dig into this, we have the expertise to develop a cost model formula. We have other states who've developed some incentives as well in terms of graduation, residence. We're fine with pursuing that work. I just want this committee to also commit to then funding that work and making sure that that model is then used. What I don't want to do is spend a tremendous amount of resources developing a model and then letting it sit there for another 10 years without it being implemented. And that's what happened with the two-year colleges. So I'd like to have further conversation about it if that's possible.
I think that would be necessary, because I think we can only move forward in the state if the legislature, which unfortunately, like it or not, there's turnover every 2 years. And so you're going to have a different group of people in here with different priorities. But I think it is something that merits a larger conversation. And I don't know if it's a task force or an interim committee or what it looks like, but I would like to continue that conversation.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Flanders, and thank you, committee, for staying and for asking all the great questions you did today. And tomorrow, no meeting. Everything from tomorrow, originally planned, was moved to Thursday. So please check the weekly agenda. The meeting is adjourned.